Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and don't forget to leave a comment telling us where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. I grew up in a small town in Pennsylvania, the kind of place where everyone knew each other's names and gossip traveled faster than the mail. But there was always one man who stood apart, someone people whispered about but rarely spoke to directly: Henry Lowe, the cemetery gravedigger. Henry was an odd man, tall and wiry with hands like tree roots, always stained with dirt no matter how much he scrubbed. He lived alone in a shack at the far end of the cemetery, near the swampy edge where mist rolled in at night. Kids dared each other to run up to his door and knock, but none stayed long enough to hear if he ever answered. When I was 16, I took a summer job at the cemetery, mowing lawns and trimming weeds. I figured it was easy cash. My first day, I saw Henry up close. He was standing over a fresh grave, shovel in hand, staring down into the pit as if hypnotized. He didn't even notice me walk past. I remember thinking there was something strange about the way he lingered there, like he wasn't just digging holes, like he was listening to them. The caretaker told me to steer clear of Henry. "He's been here longer than anyone remembers," the old man said. "Doesn't talk much, just let him be." But the more I worked there, the more I noticed things. Graves that should have been sealed looked disturbed, as if someone had been digging after the funeral was over. Strange mounds of dirt appeared in corners of the cemetery where no burials had taken place. And sometimes at night I swore I saw a lantern light moving among the headstones, long after Henry should have gone to bed. One evening, curiosity got the better of me. I stayed late, hiding near the caretaker's shed to see what Henry was up to. Around midnight, I saw him emerge from his shack, carrying a lantern and shovel. Instead of heading toward the new section of the cemetery, he walked to the oldest part, the part no one visited anymore, where the stones leaned at odd angles and names were eroded by time. I followed at a distance, crouching low behind gravestones. He stopped at one of the oldest plots, set down his lantern and began to dig. My heart pounded as I realized what he was doing. He wasn't digging a grave, he was unearthing one. The ground was soft, almost unnaturally so, as though it had been disturbed many times before. Within minutes, Henry had uncovered a coffin lid. I expected him to pry it open, but instead he knelt down, pressed his ear against the wood, and whispered something I couldn't hear. Then, to my horror, I saw the lid shift. Not much. Just a slight tremor, as if something inside had pressed upward. Henry whispered again, and the coffin stilled. He sat back on his heels, sighed, and carefully covered it back up. I wanted to scream, but my voice was caught in my throat. I stumbled back, tripping over a stone. The sound made Henry snap his head up. His lantern beam swung across the graves and landed on me. "Boy," he rasped, his voice dry like leaves. "You shouldn't be here." I ran like hell, not stopping until I was out of the cemetery and halfway home. For days I avoided work, pretending to be sick. But eventually, I had to go back. Henry never mentioned seeing me that night. In fact, he started watching me. Not in a casual way, but in that heavy, suffocating way where you feel eyes on you even when your back is turned. One afternoon, he approached me while I was trimming weeds near the western fence. He moved silently, his boots barely crunching the gravel. "You saw too much," he muttered, his voice low. My hands shook. I don't know what you mean." He gave me a long, hollow stare, then finally said, "The dead don't rest here, not all of them. They talk." I thought he was insane, but something about his tone made my stomach twist. He leaned closer, his breath sour and earthy. "They make bargains, boy. And once you start listening, you can't stop." Before I could reply, he walked away, dragging his shovel behind him, the sound grating against the stones. That night, I couldn't sleep. His words replayed in my head. They make bargains. I started to wonder if what I saw at the coffin had been real. The following week, tragedy struck. A young woman from town died in a car accident, and her funeral was held at the cemetery. I watched from a distance as her family wept, and the casket was lowered into the ground. Henry was there too, standing a little too close, staring a little too long. That night I did something reckless. I snuck back into the cemetery with a flashlight. The air was damp, fog rolling between the stones. I crept toward the woman's grave, my heart hammering in my chest. That's when I saw him again. Henry, already there, lantern glowing. He wasn't alone. The coffin lid was open, dirt scattered around like it had exploded outward. The young woman stood beside the grave, pale and trembling, her eyes blank as if she were sleepwalking. Henry held her hand, whispering into her ear. I stumbled backward, kicking a stone. Henry's head jerked toward me, his eyes wild. The woman turned too, her gaze empty but locked onto mine. "You shouldn't have come back," Henry snarled. I ran, but his words chased me. "They make bargains, boy. Once you start listening, you can't stop." The next day, the grave was sealed again, and no one in town mentioned anything unusual. But I knew what I had seen. I quit the job. But even now, years later, I dream of that night. Sometimes I wake to the sound of dirt shifting outside my window, like something clawing its way up from the earth. And sometimes, I swear I hear Henry's voice whispering, asking me if I'm ready to listen. I never thought much about cemeteries. To me, they were just quiet places filled with old stones and forgotten names. But everything changed one summer night when I agreed to help my uncle with his small-town cemetery in Ohio. He was the caretaker and needed someone to cover his night shift because he was sick. I was 19, a little broke, and thought it would be easy money. The cemetery was large, sprawling across several acres, with crooked iron gates, tall oaks that blocked the moonlight, and headstones so old the names were barely legible. It wasn't one of those modern, neat cemeteries. This one had graves dating back to the 1800s, some toppled over, some swallowed by weeds. At the very center stood a massive stone mausoleum, which everyone in town called the sleeper's house. My uncle gave me simple instructions. Walk the grounds every hour, make sure no one was trespassing, and keep the gate locked. Easy enough. I brought a flashlight, a thermos of coffee, and my phone for company. At first, it really was peaceful. The air smelled of damp grass and earth. Crickets chirped. The moon peeked through clouds, casting silver light over the rows of graves. I walked slowly between the stones, reading names, imagining the lives they once belonged to. Around midnight, I found myself near the mausoleum. That's when I saw him. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light. A tall, thin figure standing perfectly still in front of the mausoleum door. He didn't move, didn't even sway, just stood there like a shadow etched against the stone. My flashlight flickered as if the batteries were dying. When I finally steadied the beam, the figure was gone. I laughed nervously, telling myself it was just my imagination. But something in my chest tightened. I made another round, trying to shake off the unease. By 1 a.m., I was back near the mausoleum. My stomach dropped. The figure was there again, closer this time. I could make out details: a long coat, a wide-brimmed hat, and arms that hung unnaturally long, almost reaching his knees. His face, if he even had one, was hidden in shadow. I froze, gripping the flashlight like a weapon. "Hey!" I called out, my voice cracking. "This is private property!" The figure tilted his head slightly, as if studying me. Then, without a sound, he stepped backward, straight through the locked mausoleum door. I swear my heart stopped. I ran back to the caretaker's shack, slamming the door behind me. My uncle had mentioned nothing about whatever that was. I told myself I was just overtired. Maybe it was a drunk local messing with me. Maybe I imagined it. By 2 a.m., I worked up the nerve to patrol again. I didn't want to lose the job or let my uncle down. The cemetery was silent. Too silent. Even the crickets had stopped chirping. I passed rows of graves shining my light over the cracked stones. Then, halfway through the eastern side, I noticed something strange. Fresh flowers. They were laid neatly on a grave that hadn't been visited in decades, judging by the faded stone. A single red rose, glistening as if just placed. My skin prickled. I looked around. No one in sight. I crouched to read the name. Eleanor Price, 1842-1870. Something whispered behind me. Just one word. Leave. I spun around, flashlight darting across the graves. Nothing. But I swear the air carried the faintest trace of a woman's voice, drawn out like a sigh. I tried to convince myself it was just the wind, but deep down I knew I wasn't alone. When I reached the mausoleum again, my stomach twisted. The iron door, which had been rusted shut for years, now stood slightly open. Cold air poured from the gap, colder than the night itself. Against every instinct, I pushed it wider and shined my light inside. The smell hit me first. Damp stone and something sour like rotting flowers. The walls were lined with old marble crypts, names carved deep into the stone. My light swept across them until it landed on the back wall. The figure was there. This time I saw him clearly. His hat was gone, revealing a pale, gaunt face with hollow eyes that glowed faintly in the dark. His lips stretched too wide when he smiled, revealing teeth that looked more like shards of glass. I stumbled backward, dropping my flashlight. The beam rolled across the floor, landing on something worse. Footprints. Dozens of them. Bare, dirty footprints scattered across the mausoleum floor, leading from crypt to crypt. Some were small, like children's. Others were large, dragging, as if whoever made them had been limping. Then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The crypts weren't sealed anymore. Stone lids were shifted, some cracked open, revealing black gaps inside. And the footprints, they led out of them. I snatched up my flashlight and bolted, my legs barely working. Behind me, the mausoleum door creaked shut with a deafening clang. I didn't stop running until I was back at the shack, chest heaving, sweat soaking my shirt. I locked the door and pressed my back against it, listening. For the rest of the night, I heard it. Slow footsteps outside, circling the shack, dragging across the gravel. When dawn broke, I staggered out to find the cemetery looking perfectly normal. The mausoleum door was sealed again as if it had never opened. No footprints, no flowers, nothing. I told my uncle everything. He just stared at me, pale as chalk. Finally, he muttered, "You saw him." I demanded answers. My uncle explained that every caretaker eventually sees the watcher. He's been there for over a century, guarding the dead, or maybe keeping them from leaving. Nobody knows for sure. Some say he was the first person ever buried there, though no one knows his name. Others say he was a gravedigger who got trapped in the mausoleum and starved to death. But my uncle's last words haunt me the most. He doesn't just watch. Once you've seen him, he follows. And he was right. Even now, years later, I'll wake in the middle of the night and hear it. Slow, dragging footsteps outside my window. Like he's still waiting. When I was in college, I took a night security job to pay for tuition. It wasn't glamorous. I patrolled a massive cemetery on the outskirts of Boston. The place was ancient, filled with Victorian-style mausoleums, elaborate angels, and iron gates that creaked like they hadn't been touched since the Civil War. The caretaker gave me a rundown on my first day. The rules were simple. Lock the main gate at dusk, patrol every 2 hours, and report anything suspicious. But then, almost as an afterthought, he added one more thing. If you ever hear the bell, don't go looking for it. I laughed, thinking he was joking. There hadn't been a bell in the cemetery for decades. In the old days, they used safety coffins, rigged with little bells above ground so if someone was buried alive, they could ring it and be dug out. but those were long gone, rusted away, or removed. The caretaker never explained further. He just gave me a look that made me uneasy. The first few nights were uneventful. I walked the grounds, listening to the crunch of gravel beneath my boots, the occasional hoot of an owl. The cemetery was strangely peaceful. That changed on my fifth night. It was close to 1 a.m. when I heard it, the faint, unmistakable sound of a bell ringing. I froze mid-step. It wasn't far, maybe 100 yards away, coming from the oldest section of the cemetery where the tombstones leaned and crumbled with age. The ringing wasn't frantic. It was slow. One chime, a pause, another chime, like someone desperately conserving their strength. My first instinct was to follow it. Maybe some local kids had snuck in playing a prank. I gripped my flashlight and started walking, but the caretaker's warning clawed at the back of my mind. Don't go looking for it. Still, I pressed on. As I entered the oldest part of the cemetery, the bell grew louder. My light swept across cracked stones half sunken into the earth. Moss clung to everything. The air smelled damp, sour like waterlogged wood. Then I saw it. An old grave with a rusted iron frame and above it a small, tarnished bell that looked like it hadn't rung in 100 years. But it was swinging. The cord attached to it stretched down into the earth. My stomach turned cold. Against all logic, someone, or something, was pulling it from below. I crouched, shining my light on the headstone. The name was nearly erased by time, but I could make out fragments. Abigail, died 1823. The bell stopped. Silence pressed in around me. Then, faintly, I heard something worse than the ringing. A voice. It was muffled, strangled by dirt, but unmistakably human. Help me. My chest seized. It was impossible. Abigail had been dead for nearly 2 centuries, but the voice came again, more desperate this time. Help me. Please. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but some awful pull rooted me in place. I knelt down, pressing my ear to the earth, and I swear, I heard scratching, fingernails clawing at wood, scraping, splintering. I stumbled back, gasping for air. The bell swung violently now, clanging again and again. My light flickered, and in that brief darkness, I thought I saw something move, a pale hand breaking through the soil, reaching upward. Then the ground shuddered, collapsing inward with a sickening thud. The bell went still, the scratching stopped, and the silence that followed was worse than the sound itself. Shaking, I fled back to the caretaker's office. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next morning, I confronted him. I told him about the bell, the voice, the hand. His face went pale. He sat me down and finally told me the truth. The cemetery had a history. In the 1800s, dozens of people were buried alive by mistake. Comatose, misdiagnosed, declared dead too early. Families installed bells for safety. But sometimes, the bells rang long after the families stopped coming. The story said that even after the bodies decayed, the souls kept ringing. They're trapped, the caretaker whispered. Not alive, not at peace. And if you answer them, if you dig, they'll drag you down to take your place. I wanted to quit right then, but I needed the money. Against my better judgment, I stayed. Weeks passed. Some nights I heard nothing. Other nights, the bells would ring faintly in the distance. I forced myself to ignore them, repeating the caretaker's warning in my head. But one night something changed. It was late winter, snow crusting the ground. The cemetery bathed in silver moonlight. I was on patrol when I heard not one, but several bells ringing at once. Their tones overlapped, frantic, dozens of voices crying out from beneath the soil. Then came the whispers. Not muffled this time, clear, hissing around me, circling like the wind. Dig. Help us. Free us. The air grew heavy. My flashlight flickered out. In the darkness, I felt movement beneath my feet, the ground shifting, swelling, like something was crawling upward. I bolted, slipping on the ice, sprinting toward the office. Behind me, I swear I heard wood splintering, soil breaking open, and a chorus of bells ringing in unison. I locked myself inside, heart slamming against my ribs, and waited for dawn. When morning came, I stepped outside cautiously. The cemetery looked normal. No open graves, no disturbed soil. Just rows of silent stones, as if nothing had happened. I quit that day. It's been years, but the sound haunts me still. Sometimes, in the dead of night, I wake to faint ringing in the distance even though I live miles from that cemetery. And sometimes, I hear it closer, like it's coming from the walls of my own house. I never believed in ghosts, not really. I was raised in a family that thought of cemeteries as sacred places, not scary ones. My grandfather was a pastor, and he always said the dead were at peace. But that was before I spent one summer working for the County Historical Society in Virginia, tasked with cataloging graves in a forgotten cemetery that hadn't been touched in over a century. The cemetery lay deep in the woods, hidden behind thickets and blackberry vines. Locals called it Hollow Hill. I'd never heard of it until I took the assignment. My supervisor told me it dated back to the early 1700s, when the land was first settled, but had been abandoned when the town moved closer to the river. No one had been buried there in over 150 years. When I first arrived, I was struck by the silence. The woods seemed alive everywhere else, buzzing with cicadas and birdsong, but around Hollow Hill, the air was dead still. The ground was uneven, sunken in places, as though the earth itself was collapsing inward. Most of the headstones were broken, their inscriptions worn down to nothing. My job was simple: photograph each stone, record what was legible, and map the cemetery. I figured it would take a week, maybe 2, but the first night I stayed late, I realized something was wrong. As the sun dipped below the trees, the air grew thick and cold. My camera lens fogged and the woods felt watchful. I was kneeling to record a grave when I noticed the ground shifting. At first I thought it was my eyes playing tricks in the twilight, but then I saw it clearly. The soil in front of the stone was caving inward, collapsing into a small pit like the grave was hollow beneath. I crouched closer, brushing away loose dirt. The hole widened until I could see the edge of a coffin plank, rotted and crumbling. But it wasn't the decay that made me recoil. It was the emptiness. The coffin was open, completely empty. No bones, no remnants, nothing. I told myself maybe the grave had never been filled, or maybe grave robbers had taken the remains long ago. But then I checked the next grave, and the next. Each one had sunken, collapsed inward. Each coffin I glimpsed was empty. It felt as though every body buried there had climbed out and vanished. By the time I realized how widespread it was, night had fully fallen. The forest around me was suffocatingly dark, the moon hidden by clouds. I turned on my flashlight, its beam cutting through the mist curling low to the ground. That's when I saw it. Footprints. Dozens of them. Bare human footprints pressed into the soil, circling the graves, weaving in strange, chaotic patterns. Some were small, like children's. Others were long and heavy. They weren't fossilized in the old earth. They were fresh. The beam of my flashlight trembled in my hands. My stomach twisted as the truth sank in. Something had walked out of those graves. Recently. I tried to leave, stumbling through the overgrown paths, but the woods seemed to fold in on themselves, every direction leading me back toward the heart of the cemetery. The air grew colder, my breath visible in the beam of my light. Then came the whispers. At first, I thought it was the wind slipping through the trees, but the voices grew clearer, circling me in the dark. Words I couldn't quite understand, murmured in tones too low and guttural to be human. I stumbled back against a headstone, clutching my flashlight like a weapon. The whispers stopped. Silence closed in. Then, from behind me, I heard a low creak, like wood straining, splintering. I spun around. The ground split open at the base of the stone, collapsing into a jagged hole. From the darkness below, a pale hand shot upward, grasping the earth with inhuman strength. I screamed and staggered back, my flashlight beam catching a glimpse of what was crawling out. Not a skeleton, not a corpse, something else. Its skin was gray and tight, stretched over bones that seemed too long, too sharp. Its eyes were black pits, empty but hungry. It hauled itself upward, dirt spilling from its frame, and as it rose, more holes began to open all around me. The graves were breaking open one by one, hands and twisted figures clawing free from the earth. I ran. Branches tore at my arms as I plunged through the woods, the sound of scraping and dragging following me. I didn't stop until I burst out onto an old road and collapsed in the gravel. A passing driver found me hours later, shaking and covered in dirt. I told the Historical Society I wouldn't go back. They thought I was crazy, or maybe drunk, but they didn't press me. The cemetery was abandoned again, left to rot in the woods, but sometimes when I drive near that part of Virginia, I avoid the forest entirely. Because I swear, if I glance too long into the tree line, I'll see them, figures standing still between the trunks, heads tilted toward me, waiting for me to come back. And the worst part? Every time I close my eyes at night, I dream of sinking earth and empty coffins, and I hear the same whisper over and over. You don't bury the dead at Hollow Hill. You release them. When I was a child, I spent a lot of time in cemeteries. My father was the caretaker of St. Mary's Rest, a sprawling graveyard in upstate New York, and since we couldn't afford babysitters, he often brought me along while he worked. To me, it was just a place of long grass, winding gravel paths, and stone angels that looked more tired than holy. But there was one thing about St. Mary's that I never understood, even as a kid: why my father forbade me from going near the northern edge of the cemetery. He called it the broken ground. No flowers ever grew there, no grass, only crooked markers half buried in soil that seemed to sink deeper every year. I was 11 when I first wandered into the forbidden section. My father was busy trimming hedges near the front, so I slipped away, curiosity burning through me. The air changed the moment I stepped onto that ground. It was colder, heavier. The silence was unnatural, as if even the birds avoided it. The headstones there were unlike the others. Most were cracked, their names eroded beyond recognition. Some had no names at all, just numbers etched crudely into stone. I crouched beside one and brushed away dirt, revealing a single word carved faintly beneath the number: unknown. A chill ran through me. Before I could linger, I heard it, soft crying, like a child's voice carried on the wind. I thought it was coming from beyond the trees, but as I turned, I realized it was beneath me. I pressed my ear to the ground, and the sobbing grew louder, muffled as if from under layers of soil. I bolted, sprinting back to my father, who scolded me harshly when he saw where I'd come from. His face went pale when I told him about the crying. "Don't ever go there again," he warned, gripping my shoulders. "That ground doesn't belong to the living." I never fully understood what he meant, but as I grew older, the northern edge became the center of every rumor. People in town whispered that the section had once been used to bury the unwanted, the nameless, the poor, and even patients from the old asylum that burned down decades ago. My father never confirmed it. He just grew quieter whenever I asked. Years passed. I left for college, only returning home on holidays. But one winter, during my sophomore year, I got the call. My father had died suddenly of a heart attack. He was buried in St. Mary's among the rows he'd tended all his life. I thought that would be the end of my connection to the cemetery. But 2 weeks after the funeral, I received a letter in the mail. No return address, only my name scrawled in shaky handwriting. Inside was a single piece of paper, folded carefully. On it was written, "The crying child is waiting. Don't let her out." I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was some cruel prank. But the letter gnawed at me, pulling me back toward St. Mary's. On a bitter January night, I drove out there, flashlight in hand, determined to find answers. The cemetery was empty, cloaked in snow and moonlight. My breath fogged in the cold air as I made my way to the northern section. The ground there looked even worse than I remembered, sunken, broken, like it had been clawed at from below. Then I heard it again. The crying. Faint at first, then rising, a child's sobs bubbling up through the frozen earth. My skin prickled as the sound grew sharper, closer. I shined my flashlight across the graves, and that's when I saw her. A little girl, no more than 8 or 9, standing between the crooked stones. Her dress was tattered, her skin pale as the snow around her. Her eyes glistened with tears as she looked straight at me. "Help me," she whispered. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. Every instinct told me to run, but her small, broken voice tugged at something deep inside. Against all logic, I took a step closer. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice trembling. She didn't answer. Instead, she lifted one trembling hand and pointed to a stone half buried in the ground. I brushed away snow, revealing the number 37 carved crudely into the surface. Beneath it, faint and almost invisible, was another word: daughter. The sobbing stopped. The little girl's face twisted, not into a smile but into something stretched and wrong, lips curling back too far, teeth sharp and uneven. Her eyes, once tearful, were now pits of black. Before I could scream, the ground beneath me split open. Cold, skeletal hands clawed out of the soil, grasping at my legs, my arms, pulling me downward. The girl's voice shrieked in my ears, no longer weak, but booming, inhuman. "You let me out!" I wrenched free, stumbling backward, flashlight clattering to the ground. The graves all around me were heaving now, soil splitting, figures crawling upward, half-rotted and eyeless. Their mouths opened in silent wails, as if gasping for air they'd been denied for centuries. I ran, slipping and sliding through the snow, my lungs burning with cold and terror. I didn't stop until I reached my car, slamming the door shut and peeling away down the icy road. I never went back to St. Mary's Rest, but I can't escape it either, because sometimes at night I hear it outside my window, the soft, distant crying of a little girl. And when I look into the glass, I see her reflection standing behind me, her lips stretched wide, whispering the same words over and over: "You let me out." I never believed in the supernatural. Ghost stories were nothing more than drunken campfire tales to me, or late-night Reddit confessions from people who wanted attention. That all changed the night I decided to spend time in Fairview Cemetery, the same cemetery where half my family was buried. Fairview was old. Not couple of decades old, but 1800s old. The entrance was flanked by rusted iron gates, and ivy climbed the cracked stone walls that surrounded the graveyard. A weathered sign hung above the gate, barely readable: Fairview Rest. All welcome. The last part felt ironic, because very few people seemed to come here. I had gone there originally because I was restless. My dad had passed away a year earlier, and on the anniversary of his death I thought it would be meaningful to sit by his grave for a while. But when midnight approached, and the air grew damp and heavy, I realized I wasn't alone. At first it was just a sound, a faint scraping noise like someone dragging metal against stone. It echoed between the rows of graves, sharp and steady, as if it had a rhythm. I froze, clutching my flashlight tighter. I scanned the dark, expecting to see some vagrant or caretaker, but the light only caught old headstones, leaning at odd angles like crooked teeth. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding far weaker than I intended. The scraping stopped. I thought about leaving, but something rooted me to the spot. Maybe it was stubbornness, maybe fear, maybe both. That's when I noticed something strange. A patch of ground, just a few feet away from my father's grave, looked freshly disturbed. The soil was darker, damp and uneven, unlike the hard-packed earth around it. Then came the whisper, low, raspy, so faint I thought at first it was the wind. Not his grave. Yours. I spun around so fast I almost dropped the flashlight. Nothing but tombstones, trees swaying and shadows. But the voice had been close, right behind me. The scraping sound started again, louder this time. My light shook as I followed the sound to its source. A figure crouched by the disturbed patch of dirt. At first I thought it was a groundskeeper because the man was holding a shovel. But the more I stared, the more wrong everything seemed. His clothes were old, really old, like something out of a black and white photograph. His hat sat crooked in his face. His face looked too pale, too stretched, his mouth too wide as he smiled at me. "Late night, isn't it?" he croaked, jabbing the shovel into the ground with a thud. I stumbled back, muttering something like, "Sorry, I was just visiting." "You're early," he interrupted. "What?" He tapped the headstone beside him, one that looked cracked and forgotten. My flashlight beam fell on the name carved into it, and my stomach dropped. It wasn't my father's name. It was mine. My full name. The date of death carved beneath it was today's date. I froze, my brain refusing to process what I was seeing. "Been waiting for you," the pale man said, tilting his head, his grin stretching impossibly wide. "Best not keep the ground hungry." The soil near the headstone began to shift as though something beneath it was pushing upward. The disturbed dirt bulged, cracked, and then a hand shot out. A skeletal gray hand with sharp nails clawing at the surface. Another followed. Then a head, empty eye socket staring directly at me. I bolted. I don't even remember how I made it to the gate, but when I finally reached my car, I was trembling so hard I dropped the keys twice before I could start the engine. I sped away, my headlights bouncing across the road, too terrified to even look in the rearview mirror. The next morning, I forced myself back there, half convinced it had been some fever dream, or that grief and exhaustion had made me hallucinate. When I arrived, the patch of ground was neat and flat, just like the rest of the cemetery. No disturbed soil, no cracked headstone. But there was one thing I couldn't explain. A small pile of dirt sat directly on top of my father's grave. And stuck in the dirt was an old, rusted shovel, its handle carved with 3 words, "See you soon." And the worst part? When I checked again the following week, the headstone I had seen the night before, the one with my name on it, was there. The same cracked stone, the same carved date of death. Only now, the soil in front of it looked freshly disturbed. I grew up in a small town in Maine, the kind of place where gossip traveled faster than the wind off the coast. Our town had its share of urban legends, stories about witches, sea creatures, and the usual small-town mysteries. But nothing terrified us kids more than Hollow Pine Cemetery. It wasn't just because it was old, or because the headstones leaned like they were about to collapse. It was the stories people told about the man who guarded it, the so-called keeper of Hollow Pines. Supposedly, he wasn't alive anymore. Some claimed he was a ghost of the original groundskeeper who had gone insane and murdered trespassers. Others whispered that he had made some kind of pact, trading his humanity for eternal guardianship over the dead. I laughed at those stories when I was younger, but as an adult, when I returned to my hometown for my mother's funeral, I stopped laughing. It was late when I finally found the courage to visit Hollow Pines. My mother had always told me never to go there after dark, but grief makes you reckless. She was buried on the far side, under a pine tree whose branches twisted like skeletal fingers. I wanted to sit by her grave and talk even if nobody answered. The night was damp and thick with fog, the kind that clung to your skin. My flashlight cut through the mist in a weak beam, revealing rows of weathered headstones. I felt alone, until I heard footsteps crunching behind me. At first I thought it was another mourner, but when I turned, there was no one, just fog curling between the trees. I sat by my mother's grave and whispered about my life, about how empty the house felt without her. I don't know how long I sat there, but eventually, I heard it again. Footsteps, closer this time. Then came the sound of something dragging across the ground. Slow, heavy, like a shovel or a chain. "Hello?" I called, my voice trembling. The dragging stopped. Silence. Then a man's voice, rough and hollow, carried through the mist. "You shouldn't be here." Every hair on my body stood up. I shone my flashlight in the direction of the voice. That's when I saw him. He stood at the edge of the fog, tall and thin, wearing an old groundskeeper's coat that looked soaked with years of rain. His hat shadowed most of his face, but what I did see made me choke back a gasp. His skin looked gray like stone, and his eyes glowed faintly, almost like dying embers. In one hand, he held a rusted lantern that flickered without a flame. In the other, he dragged a long iron rake across the dirt, leaving deep scratches wherever he walked. "I'm just visiting my mother," I stammered. "She's not here," the man rasped. My blood went cold. I knew she was. I'd buried her just days ago. "She belongs to me now," he continued, his lantern glowing brighter as he stepped closer. The light revealed something horrifying. The graves nearest him were disturbed, sunken in, like the earth had swallowed them. And as he dragged the rake, the ground trembled, the soil shifting like something underneath was trying to claw its way out. I scrambled to my feet, backing away, but he raised the lantern higher and the fog seemed to thicken around me, wrapping me in cold, damp air. "Once the soil takes them, they're mine," he said. His voice was no longer just a man's voice. It was layered, deep and echoing like a dozen voices speaking in unison. "You should not disturb the keeper." Suddenly, the earth beneath my mother's grave split open with a sickening crack. I screamed as the coffin tilted, soil spilling inward, and from the pit came a hand, pale, rotted. My mother's hand, or something wearing her skin, grasped at the air, clawing upward. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, frozen in terror, as the keeper lowered the lantern toward the open grave. The light from it wasn't warm, wasn't natural. It was cold, greenish, seeping into the coffin like poison. My mother's face emerged from the dirt, but it wasn't hers anymore. Her eyes were gone, her mouth twisted unnaturally wide as she whispered in a voice that wasn't her own. "Stay with me." I bolted, tripping over headstones, my flashlight slipping from my hand. I ran blindly through the fog until I found the gate. The moment I passed through it, the air cleared. The fog stayed behind, thick and impenetrable, as though it refused to let me see back inside. I collapsed against my car, sobbing, gasping for air. The next morning I returned with the courage daylight provides. My mother's grave was sealed, neat, undisturbed, like nothing had happened. No sign of the keeper, no sign of the fog. But when I knelt down to brush dirt from her headstone, my heart nearly stopped. Scratched deep into the stone as though carved by metal claws were 3 words. "See you tonight." When I was in college, I took a summer job cataloging graves in a historic cemetery outside of Savannah, Georgia. It sounded easy enough. Walk the rows, photograph headstones, log names and dates into a database. The place had a kind of beauty, with moss-draped oaks and marble angels leaning gracefully over the dead. It was peaceful by day. But once dusk fell, that cemetery became something else entirely. It started with the stories the locals told me. They spoke about a woman who roamed the grounds, always dressed in black from head to toe, her face hidden behind a lace veil. They called her the mourner. According to legend, she was a widow from the 1800s who had buried her husband there and never left. Some said she wept over strangers' graves. Others swore she lured the living to join her in eternal mourning. I laughed at first, dismissing it as Southern ghost lore, but my laughter didn't last. One evening, I stayed later than usual. The sun had already dipped below the trees and the air grew heavy with that wet, sweet smell of magnolias mixed with something else, damp soil, rotting leaves. I was crouched by a tilted gravestone, typing into my tablet, when I heard it, the faint sound of sobbing. It was soft at first, almost a trick of the wind, but it grew louder, rawer, filled with grief so deep it made my chest ache just hearing it. I froze. The sound was coming from somewhere behind me. I turned slowly, and that's when I saw her. She stood by a large, crumbling mausoleum, dressed entirely in black, a heavy gown that swept the ground, a veil hiding her face. Her shoulders shook as she wept into gloved hands. The sight was so sudden, so real, that I thought for a moment she was a tourist or an actress. I almost called out to her, but something in my gut screamed at me to stay quiet. Then, as if sensing me, she lifted her head. I couldn't see her face, not fully. The veil was too thick. But I caught glimpses through the lace. A pale cheek streaked with something dark, lips that didn't quite move like human lips should, eyes that gleamed unnaturally, reflecting no light. And then, without a sound, she vanished. 1 second she was there, weeping by the mausoleum, and the next, she was gone. I told myself I was imagining things, that exhaustion and shadows were playing tricks on me. But when I packed up to leave, I noticed something odd. The ground where she had stood was damp, as if someone had been kneeling there for hours, and on the stone steps of the mausoleum lay a single black glove. The next day I brought it up with one of the older groundskeepers, a wiry man named Frank, his face drained of color. "You saw her?" he asked quietly. "The mourner?" I laughed nervously. "I guess, but it had to be some prank, right?" Frank shook his head. "No prank, she's real enough. I've worked here 30 years, seen her twice. Each time a week later someone died, someone young." I tried to shrug it off, but his words clung to me like the damp air. I told myself it was just superstition, but part of me was terrified. A week passed. Nothing happened. I began to relax, even joke about it. And then, on the 7th night, my phone rang. It was my best friend from college sobbing into the receiver. One of our classmates, healthy, athletic, only 20, had died in a sudden car crash. The coincidence made my blood run cold. I returned to the cemetery the next day, desperate for answers. I searched the mausoleum where I had seen her, combed the grass, peered into the shadows. That's when I saw her again. This time she wasn't weeping. She was standing in the middle of the path, still dressed in black, veil hiding her face. She raised her hand slowly and pointed directly at me. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. My heart slammed against my ribs like it wanted out. And then she spoke. Her voice was low, drawn out, each word dripping like poison. "Next is you." The glove I'd found earlier, gone. The damp patch of earth where she had knelt, fresh again. I quit that job the next morning, left Savannah, and swore I'd never set foot in that cemetery again. But to this day I still dream about her. In the dreams, she's closer each time. And the veil? It's starting to lift. I never expected a summer internship to nearly destroy my sanity. During my last year at university, I got accepted into a small anthropology project in Pennsylvania. Our task was to document an abandoned cemetery on the outskirts of town, a place locals called Black Hollow. It wasn't on any official records, which made it perfect for our research. Or so we thought. Black Hollow was unlike any cemetery I had ever seen. The headstones weren't arranged in neat rows, but scattered, as if the dead had been buried wherever there was space. Many of the stones were cracked in half, names eroded by rain and time, the inscriptions unreadable. The air felt wrong the moment we stepped in, thick, charged, like a storm was about to break. Even in broad daylight, shadows seemed to stretch farther than they should have. There were 4 of us in the group, me, 2 other students, and our professor, Dr. Avery. He was fascinated by forgotten graveyards, convinced they revealed untold truths about history. We spent days photographing stones, measuring plots, and sketching the layout of the grounds. But on the 3rd day, something changed. It began with the whispers. At first, I thought it was one of my classmates talking while I worked, but every time I turned, they were silent. The whispers were faint, urgent, like dozens of voices speaking at once just below the surface of the earth. When I knelt to photograph one of the sunken graves, I swore the sound grew louder. My skin crawled as if unseen fingers were brushing against it. I told myself it was just wind passing through the tall grass. But then, on the 5th day, we uncovered something that made denial impossible. We found a headstone that had fallen backward, half buried in soil. Beneath it was a hollow space, a small crypt or chamber that had collapsed. Inside, instead of a coffin, there were bones scattered like someone had clawed their way out. Scratched into the underside of the stone were words etched with something sharp. "Let us out." Dr. Avery dismissed it as vandalism from decades ago, but I could see the way his hands shook as he recorded it. That night I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard the whispers again, closer, clearer. By the 6th day, the rest of the team was hearing them too. One student, Claire, swore she felt her name being whispered. The other, Mark, claimed he saw a hand pushing up from the soil. Dr. Avery tried to keep us calm, but his eyes had dark rings, like he hadn't slept in days. On the 7th day, everything fell apart. We were gathered near the center of the cemetery when the ground beneath us began to tremble. Dirt shifted, headstones rattled, and a low moan rose from the earth, vibrating in our bones. The whispers turned into screams. Terrified, we scattered. I tripped over a broken marker and fell hard, my hands sinking into damp soil. That's when I felt it, fingers wrapping around my wrist from beneath the ground. I screamed, yanking myself free. A pale skeletal hand burst through the dirt, followed by another, then another. All around me, the graves were opening, not in silence, but with a sound I'll never forget, the grinding of stone and the tearing of earth, as if the cemetery itself was waking up. Claire and Mark were already running. Dr. Avery shouted something I couldn't hear, his voice drowned out by the chaos. I scrambled to my feet and followed, but not before I saw what was climbing out of the graves. They weren't whole corpses, they weren't skeletons. They were something in between. Faces stretched with rotted flesh, eyes glowing faintly, mouths gaping wide as they shrieked. Their movements were jerky, wrong, as though they weren't used to their bodies anymore. We didn't stop running until we reached the road. By then, Dr. Avery was gone. Claire, Mark, and I stood gasping, filthy, too terrified to speak. When we went back with police the next morning, the cemetery was calm again. No open graves, no signs of disturbance, just silence. But here's the part that makes me doubt my own sanity. The next week, a new headstone appeared in Black Hollow. Fresh granite, polished, untouched by time. It bore a single name, Dr. Jonathan Avery. The date of death was listed as the very day he vanished. And last month I went back alone. Something inside me couldn't let go. I walked through the crooked stones, searching, praying it had all been some kind of nightmare. But when I reached the center, I saw it. A new marker. My name. My date of death. Next week. And as I stood frozen, the whispers started again. Only this time they weren't asking to be let out. They were laughing. I grew up in a rural town in Oregon, where the forests are dense and the nights go dark earlier than most people are used to. My fascination with cemeteries began when I was a teenager, sneaking into local graveyards to take photos for a photography class. But one place always drew me more than the rest. Cedar Hollow Cemetery, a sprawling site perched on a hill, surrounded by ancient pines whose roots twisted over the graves. The older townsfolk spoke of a figure called the Lantern Man. They said he was a caretaker from the 1800s who had gone mad, wandering the cemetery with a lantern that never burned out, searching for graves that weren't his to guard. The stories made me laugh back then. Teenage bravado, you know. But something about Cedar Hollow always felt off. I decided to spend the night there once, wanting to capture night photography for my portfolio. I brought a tent, snacks, a thermos of coffee, and my camera gear. The first hours were quiet, peaceful even. Fog rolled in from the valley, curling around headstones like smoke. My flashlight and camera light barely penetrated it. I thought about leaving when I saw a faint light flickering through the fog, too steady to be a star, too dim to be a street lamp. I froze. It was moving. Slowly, methodically, along the winding path between graves, a lantern glowed. A figure followed behind it, tall, thin, dressed in black that seemed to absorb the fog instead of reflect it. His steps were silent, yet each movement seemed to reverberate through the air. I reminded myself that it had to be someone else camping or perhaps a photographer like me. But instinct told me otherwise. I crouched behind a tombstone, camera in hand, trying to snap a picture. The figure paused, then turned slowly toward me. Even in the faint glow of the lantern, I couldn't see a face. It was as if the shadows themselves had formed the shape of a man. My heart pounded in my chest. Then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The lantern wasn't just glowing, it was absorbing light. The fog around it darkened as if reality itself was being pulled toward it. The more the lantern approached, the colder the air became, my breath forming misty clouds even in the mild night. I ran. Branches clawed at my face and arms as I sprinted through the rows of crooked graves. Behind me I could hear a dragging sound, metal scraping stone, soft but relentless. I glanced back, and the lantern man was closer, though I had been running for minutes. He seemed to float rather than walk. The lantern's glow cast shadows that stretched unnaturally, crawling over tombstones like living creatures. I tripped and fell against an angel statue. My flashlight skittered across the ground, illuminating something I'll never forget. A grave that had been empty when I arrived, no marker, just disturbed soil, was now open. And crawling out from it were figures, pale, faceless, dragging themselves on their hands and knees. The lantern man stood at the edge of the pit, lifting the lantern higher. His voice echoed then, not through the air, but inside my head. They belong to me now, and soon, you will too. I scrambled to my feet and ran blindly. Somehow I made it to the edge of the cemetery, the lantern's glow fading in the distance. I didn't stop until I reached the road. My camera lay on the ground back in the cemetery, its memory card untouched. I didn't check it. I never will. A week later, I received a letter. No return address. Inside was a single photograph. Me, asleep in my tent that night, and in the corner of the frame, barely visible, the lantern man, standing over me, lantern glowing, faceless, watching. I don't go near Cedar Hollow anymore. I don't talk about it. But sometimes on foggy nights, I swear I see a faint light through the trees. And I know. The lantern man is still walking, still searching, and he never forgets. I had always been fascinated by old cemeteries, but nothing prepared me for Ravenswood Cemetery, a place steeped in local legend. I was visiting my uncle in Massachusetts when he told me about it. A sprawling graveyard from the 1700s, famous for a lone bell tower that no longer worked. Locals whispered that the bell rang itself, only for those who were about to die, and that the sound brought the dead closer to the living. I laughed it off as superstition, but my curiosity wouldn't let it go. I decided to visit one late October evening. The air was cold, crisp with the scent of decaying leaves. Fog rolled low, curling between crooked gravestones that leaned like broken teeth. The cemetery had been abandoned for decades. Weeds and ivy had claimed paths once well-trodden. I stepped cautiously, flashlight cutting through the darkness. At first, it was peaceful. The wind rustled the trees, owls hooted in the distance, and the only sound was the crunch of dead leaves under my boots. Then, I heard it. A faint, hollow ringing. At first, I assumed it was the wind striking a metal fence. But as I drew closer, I realized it was coming from the bell tower itself, swaying slightly though the old rope and mechanism had long since rotted away. 1 slow toll, 2, then 3. Each chime resonated deep in my chest, cold and hollow, making the hair on my arms rise. I tried to leave, but the fog thickened around me and the air felt heavier, almost suffocating. The ringing continued, now accompanied by whispers. Soft, incoherent at first, then unmistakably voices, calling names. My name. Panic rising, I stumbled toward the edge of the cemetery, but the path seemed to shift beneath my feet. One moment, I was near the entrance. The next, I was back among the graves, circling the bell tower. Shadows moved at the edges of my vision. I could swear I saw figures standing silently between tombstones, pale faces turned toward me, waiting. Desperate, I ducked behind a large monument, a marble angel with its face eroded by time. I tried to calm my racing heart, telling myself it was all in my head. Then I felt it, a cold hand on my shoulder, ice-cold fingers pressing against my skin. I spun around. Nothing, just fog and gravestones. But the sound of footsteps followed, slow and deliberate, crunching leaves as though someone was trailing me through the mist. The bell tolled again, once, then twice, then a slow series of continuous clangs. The sound made the ground tremble beneath me, and then I saw them. The dead. They weren't whole, not in the usual sense. Their flesh was gray, stretched tight over bones, eyes black pits of emptiness, mouths twisted in silent screams. They moved in jerky, unnatural motions, clawing through the soil as if the ground itself had betrayed them. The whispers intensified, merging into a cacophony that made my ears bleed. I ran blindly, tripping over roots and tombstones. Every time I thought I saw the exit, the cemetery seemed to stretch further, paths leading me deeper into the fog. I could hear the dead behind me now, shuffling, scratching, whispering my name over and over. Finally, I stumbled into a clearing near the bell tower. The air was electric, heavy with a sense of impending doom. The bell tolled one final time, louder than before, each chime sending shivers through my entire body. The ground cracked beneath it, and I saw dozens of figures climbing out of the graves, all moving toward me, silent but terrifyingly purposeful. I collapsed, sobbing, covering my face, convinced this was the end. The bell's echo reverberated through the fog and the whispers became screams. Then, suddenly, everything stopped. Silence, thick and oppressive. When I opened my eyes, the dead were gone. The bell tower was still. The fog hung in the air, motionless, and at my feet lay a small, blackened bell, no larger than a child's hand. I picked it up, and it rang once, softly, faintly, and in that moment, I felt a presence behind me whispering in a voice I could never forget. "You've heard it now. Forever." I left Ravenswood Cemetery that night, and never returned. But every time I hear a bell ringing in the distance, I freeze. Because I know deep down it's not a church bell, it's a morning bell, and I can feel the dead coming for me. I never believed in curses or ghosts. Never. Until the summer I took a job at Whispering Pines Cemetery in Vermont. I was 19, desperate for cash, and figured cataloging tombstones for a local historian would be a quiet, easy way to make money. It was the kind of cemetery most people avoided, overgrown, half-forgotten, with gnarled trees stretching their roots over cracked headstones. The locals said it was cursed, but I laughed off their warnings. The first few days were mundane. I photographed stones, recorded inscriptions, and made notes for the historian. But there was one section the historian had told me to avoid, the northwest corner, beyond the old oak grove. He said it was unstable, but I noticed the tone in his voice. Fear. Not caution, but real fear. I assumed it was overprotectiveness of history. On the 5th day, curiosity got the better of me. I stepped into the forbidden northwest corner. The air changed immediately. It became heavier, colder, as if the earth itself had grown denser. The headstones were ancient, some cracked beyond recognition, and the grass grew so thick that my boots sank with every step. The smell of damp soil and decay clung to the air. That's when I saw it. A man, or something that resembled a man, stood among the graves. He was tall, stooped slightly, and wore a dark coat that looked centuries old. His face was hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat, and his hands clasped a long, thin staff that dug into the dirt. But it wasn't the figure itself that terrified me. It was the way he moved. He didn't walk. He glided, silent, his presence pressing down like a weight on my chest. I froze. The figure lifted its head slowly, tilting it as though studying me. Then, without warning, it disappeared. Not like someone walking away. It vanished, leaving nothing but a faint chill in the air. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but my feet rooted themselves to the soil, as though the earth itself held me there. Hours passed. The sun sank low, turning the sky a sickly orange, and I realized I had wandered far from the path. Shadows twisted unnaturally around me, and whispers began, soft at first, almost playful. Then they grew louder, clearer, forming words I could barely comprehend. He waits. He watches. He chooses. I tried to run, but every step felt heavier. The whispers seemed to wrap around me, pulling at my mind. Then I saw the graves. One after another, the soil began to shift as though something beneath was rising. Hands, pale and skeletal, clawed toward the surface. Faces, twisted in agony, pressed through the earth, their mouths opening in silent screams. The figure appeared again, standing at the center, unmoving, staff pressing into the ground. He raised one hand and the dead froze. The whispers stopped. Silence. Then he spoke, not with a voice, but in my head. One must join them. One must remain. I screamed and ran, blindly through the overgrown paths, the graves, the roots that seemed to grab at my ankles. Behind me the ground shifted constantly, rising and falling like breathing. And then I stumbled upon a grave that made my blood run cold. It was mine. My name was etched into the cracked stone. The date of death? Tomorrow. I fell to my knees, tears freezing on my face in the night air. That's when I understood. The figure, the watcher, the cemetery itself. It had chosen me. It wasn't just guarding the dead, it was feeding them. It needed a living soul to remain among the graves, to keep the balance, to ensure the whispers never faded. I tried to run again, but the northwest corner had shifted. Paths twisted impossibly. The trees leaned closer. And then I felt it. Hands, cold, skeletal, pulling me down into the soil. I screamed until my lungs burned, until my vision blurred. The last thing I saw before the earth swallowed me completely was the figure, standing over me, staff in hand, tilting its hat as if to say, "Welcome to the forgotten." The historian later told the town I had disappeared. No trace, no evidence, only a faint whisper in the wind whenever anyone ventured near the northwest corner. And now, sometimes when I close my eyes at night, I hear it. Soft, cold, and insistent. The watcher waits. You cannot leave.